IVM.
Hi guys, so welcome to our new edition of Know Your Kanun, where I have two very interesting gentlemen on the show, and they'll be talking about the main facet of the Indian judiciary, that is the delay, which has been hogging us constantly for the past so many years. But into all contrast, what we've been discussing over the show for the past 2 years, or what we've seen in the courts, I think they would be able to provide a really deep insight as to what are the major causes and how can we rectify them. So I would like to welcome Mr. Harish Narasappa and Mr. Surya Prakash. Welcome, sirs. Welcome to the show. And I'd like to start with Mr. Harish first. Sir, could you just please introduce yourself, sir, and just talk in general about the whole episode as to why and how you arrived at this book, and what do you try to achieve through this?
Right. So thanks, Amber, and it's a pleasure being here and talking to you.
Absolutely.
So we have been working on, when I say we, it's Daksh. We at Daksh have been working on the issue of judicial delays for the last 5 years.
Right. Sir.
Now, as you rightly said, everybody in India knows that the court system is very slow and cases take a long time to get resolved.
Right.
Now,
Sir.
5 years ago, when we started researching this issue,
Right.
what we discovered is that very few people know the details of this delay. If you ask anyone, you say, I believe there are 3 crore cases pending. And they'll say, it takes a long time. It takes 10 years, 8 years, whatever. But there is very little data-based, analysis of what exactly is wrong and what are the intricacies. So do we drill down the 3 crore cases? If we go deep down, what are the kinds of cases that get stuck? Why do they get stuck? All of these were questions that were not answered before Daksh started with data analysis. So we have been doing this work for the last 5 years. This is actually our 3rd book. The earlier 2 books were also on similar issues. So what we have done is we have built a database of cases that allows us to analyze why delay occurs. So our approach was to understand on a day-to-day basis what goes wrong. Because, 3 crore cases is the end result. But what happens on a day-to-day basis in courts is what needs to be analyzed and studied. And that is what we have done over the last, 5.5 years since Daksh started focusing on the issue of judicial delays. So that's the introduction broadly to our work and what we do. About myself, I'm a lawyer as well. I practice law. I'm the partner at a firm called Samvad Partners. It's a corporate and commercial law firm. And then I'm also the co-founder of Daksh. So there you go.
Welcome on the show, sir. Indeed a pleasure to have you on. And the right kind of intro we needed to before set the tone to the whole show. And now, Mr. Surya, good evening, sir. Welcome to the show. I'd like to take the ball to your court now, and maybe if you can just talk about and give us your insight on the whole gist, sir.
Thanks so much, Amber, for having me on the show. Like how Harish was mentioning, what Daksh has brought to this discourse on judicial delay is very grounded empirical work, whether it be in the form of case data on what happens in a court on a day-to-day basis, or expectations of litigants from a survey. The first time a survey of national litigants was done, 10,000 people in 2016, or the expectation of citizens were concerned in 2017, the Approaches to Justice survey that we did, of 45,000 citizens across the country, all of them national surveys. So our approach has been to be grounded very much in data and talking about what happens in a court on a day-to-day basis. And again, not so much on the outcomes, but on the process, because these are really leading metrics that everybody should be focused on if we want to get the right result. So that's what Daksh has been doing. It's been a wonderful journey for me. I come from a corporate background. I'm a chartered accountant and a law graduate. Spent most of my time in IT, MNCs, handling the tax function, and joined Daksh in 2015 when the Rule of Law project was started. a fantastic opportunity for me to understand what happens in the judiciary and contribute to the next phase of the evolution of the judiciary in India.
Absolutely, sir, and thank you for that detailed intro on this. I might add my little experiences to the same. So, before I started my own the recent I would say the legal career, I was part of PricewaterhouseCoopers, and I was handling a lot of taxation. Now, when you rightly said that that there was a lot of issues and delays that you feel you face at maybe tribunal levels or maybe at court levels or vice versa, it was something which is actually causing, I would say, a lot of economic and as well as on an emotional level, a denting and a damage to our systems in place. And with that in place, sir, let me start by first reviewing your book, and maybe let's just start with some of the paras that I have, and maybe we can elucidate on each of them. So let's to begin with, sir, what I would want to ask from you is, how complex do you think the current judicial system is, that it needs to have a judicial reform? I mean, and to that context, I would like to add that, let's say, sir, a comparative study, if I draw with a parallel common law jurisdiction, in terms of judicial reforms which we've had, where we talk about court procedures and proceedings, where do you think, sir, we are lacking? Is it more about promulgation of instructions, guidelines, or the speedy mechanisms? Because if you compare it with UK, I mean, and it's a very fast comparison that I'm doing, or maybe with Canada for that matter of fact, the concept of judicial reforms in India are actually not talking about speedy justice and trial, though they are enshrined in the Constitution. So what do you feel is the major cause, sir? I'll start with Mr. Harish, sir, first.
Okay, so there are many answers to this, but let's take the big picture, right? Right. In terms of the jurisdictions that you compared, yes, in terms of process, we are similar to them. I mean, our processes are similar to are borrowed from the UK.
Yes.
But what has happened is we have not kept pace, right? The UK has seen a rapid evolution of their civil procedure code.
Right.
Very far-reaching, very progressive. We have not been able to reform our procedural laws very well. In fact, I think, there's only been one or two significant procedural reforms since independence, right?
Right.
And there are various reasons for it. But without going into, whether there is a need to reform the procedural rules, which there is, and it needs a complete thorough overhaul. And particularly now with advancing, tech and the ability to use tech tools, I think there's need for a reform. So that's one part. The second part, which is actually more real, is on a day-to-day basis, there's a lot of uncertainty in the system. Okay, let me give you an example. So since you're also a lawyer, if your case is listed today, right, when you are going into court that day, you don't know what is going to happen. Okay, whether your case will be heard, or whether it will be postponed, or whether it will be only partially heard, or anything else. And it may sound strange to somebody who doesn't see the system, but the uncertainty is the name of the game, right? So there is no certainty of event. If X is supposed to happen today, there is no guarantee that it will happen. Now the second problem, right? So that X may or may not happen. So tomorrow it doesn't happen, they give you another day, which is 10 days from now. Even on that day, we don't know whether it will happen or not.
Nice.
So a lot of our work has been around creating certainty of events on every hearing. And we believe that is the key to sort out the backlog. See, because procedures will always be complicated. And your question was, how complicated is our procedure? I think legal procedure is complicated, whether in this country or anywhere else. It's only a question of degree. Excuse me. But I think we have made it more complicated by adding uncertainty to the procedure. And I think that is where we can try and move forward rather than amending the entire procedure as such.
Because I would have another point with you on this before we even I come to Mr. Surya on this, is that and I rightly agree with you, sir, that now a part of the firm that I am working with, my brother's firm, and the firm we own, we also do criminal litigation. And I was appearing for one of my clients in, let's say, Haryana Punjab High Court, and I would rightly agree with you, because he was to be set on bail, and I'm disclosing facts as we speak, but it was being denied on not valid and merit grounds, but just because of the reason that we couldn't operate or proceed with our daily functioning, whether it was the defense lawyer concerned or whether it was, the witness was the problem. And as lawyers, it becomes our professional responsibility, because if I charge you an XYZ amount, I mean, you do expect me to also justify myself. And then ultimately, when you fall prey to such a situation, it actually leaves you quite perplexed with your preparation, with your arguments and so many things. And a lot of lawyers who are beginning out, sir, and I would say to them that, do not be disheartened, because when we are in law colleges, there's a lot of concept that, what you read in the books is a complete different scenario than what is happening in paper. And I think that's what the book is trying to address in terms of complexities of the procedures and how we operate. Coming to you, Mr. Surya, sir, what would you like to comment on this in terms of, your experience as well? Harish sir has rightly put it out there blatantly. I would like to have your take as well on this.
So, Amber, to extend that point about uncertainty, yes, and what it meant, you talked about for the lawyers and, yep, for the litigants individually. But what we have done in the Access to Justice Survey of 2017 is we actually quantified what it means to the country as a whole, right, what this uncertainty is costing the country. A right, very conservative estimate gave us 0.5% of the GDP was lost every, yes, year, yes, about 50,000 crores 4 years back, just because of loss of productivity and income, because litigants and witnesses have to come to courts.
Right, absolutely.
That's a very conservative estimate, and we easily think that can be 2x, 3x of that.
Yes, absolutely.
So it is costing the country. Now, on what is judicial reform is a never-ending destination. Every country will have judicial reform, like having a good constitution. It is a state that you always have to work towards. But judicial reform in our country is about increasing capacity so that the wonderful pronouncements on access to justice and enforcing rights of the people, or fast access to fast trial and speedy trial is given effect to. The idea is there. How do you make it happen on the ground continuously, yes, transaction after transaction? That is the challenge before us as a democracy when we mature. That is the next stage of our evolution.
No, and I rightly agree with you to a huge extent. The economic loss and the emotional quotient, if you manage to say, in terms of clientele and so forth, as drainage of our energy when we are there on a daily basis, whether it's an amateur lawyer or a professional lawyer or vice versa, it causes a lot of setback to the whole system. And Mr. Surya, this is again, let's digress a little from the legal aspect of it being in courts, even in terms of tribunals, whether it is your taxation or whether it is indirect taxation, direct taxation, or your, the earlier CSTATs, etc. If you look at the procedural delays, at least because these tribunals were set up to fast track situation than to give you better results, right? So even at those levels, if you see, there is a huge lag, in terms of whether it is manpower, whether it is, procedural, or let's say other things. What about your experience? So you're a chartered accountant to that effect. Maybe, you would be much more aware of details there and can shine some light on the same.
Right. No, the reason why tribunals were set up was it was promised that you would get a better deal than in courts.
Yes.
Right? Yes. In fact, they specifically say that procedural relaxation would be there so as to meet the needs of justice, that you will have an expert member sitting who can have a good view on the difficult subject matter.
Absolutely.
Go ahead. I think to the extent of getting this expertise, there has definitely been a positive impact on the this one. But from a procedural aspect or from a time, I don't see too much of a difference between tribunals and courts. Again, we may be generalizing when we say tribunals because there are so many different tribunals. Income tax appeal tribunal and CESTAT are just one, and probably the better end of the spectrum. There are many other tribunals.
Absolutely.
Right? We've heard of the intellectual property appellate tribunal, which has not had even benches constituted for years. Right? There are state level tribunals that nobody seems to be bothered about and are just extensions of government departments.
So labor laws, sir. Labor laws, rightly said. The worst being labor laws. Yes.
So it's a very mixed bag when it comes to tribunals.
Now, Harisha, I'll come back to you before now I open the paras. There was one interesting, aspect where I've seen there was a Canadian client we were representing in India, and I happened to go through that client for a matter of real estate that happened in Delhi. And what we faced there was this, that when we told the client that, it's not going to happen for next 3 months, what you're expecting, whether it is in terms of dates, etc. He said, there is a limitation period in our courts that the matter has to be disposed of on the basis of classification of the matter within time period slated. Now, don't you feel that that's a lag that we have, that we don't have a definition of time period as such, which we implement for disposing of such cases, whether it would be appeals, fresh applications, FIRs, etc., or revision petitions? Don't you see, sir, that we are lagging there also?
See, actually, there are some rules to this effect now in the new Commercial Codes bill, and also in the new Commercial Codes Act, and also in the IBC. There are strict timelines. But apart from that, pursuant to a decision of the Supreme Court, high courts have drafted something called case flow management rules for the district judiciary.
Yes, sir.
And they make it very clear that it contains detailed guidelines as to the time within which different types of cases have to be disposed of.
Yes.
Now it is not happening. That is a reality. Okay. So why it is not happening? Nobody has actually tried to implement it with an iron hand. Now, apart from that, as I said, there are operational issues, right? So the judges need help. Judges are not administrators or systemic managers. So they need help in ensuring that they follow some of these rules that have been set up and drafted quite carefully. Now, so some amount of reform on the judicial administration side also needs to happen. Something that few of us have been suggesting, that there should be a judicial administration, so a dedicated administrative servant within the judiciary that focuses only on the administration. Right. So that is something we have been focusing on. But it's interesting the point that you mentioned about your client. See, one of the things that we as lawyers don't realize is the impact that this judicial delay has on wider society. Apart from your own client, what happens to the others? And that is what we have tried to cover in this book, in this volume.
Right.
So, as you can see from the title, it's Justice Frustrated and the impact of delays. And we have covered various aspects. So there are people who have written on, Manaswini has written about economic impact. Right. Surya himself has written about, the capacity and infrastructure, impact on litigation. There's from TIS who has written about, impact on prisoners. So there are multifarious consequences of judicial delay, and which is causing ripple effects in society without the judiciary or the government realizing it. So this book actually tries to focus on that. So using hard data, it tries to analyze the effects of judicial delay on society as a whole, and from an interdisciplinary perspective. That's what this book does.
So I'll now open the document with me and take you. Maybe you guys can talk about each of the heads, sir, as you said, and maybe explain to our listeners, some of the parts of the book which we can take up. I see a head where it says the culture of adjournments and inaccessibility of the courts, the litigant experience. Now, maybe, sir, on that head, if Mr. Surya and you can probably just give us a gist. that the heads itself says what it means, but most of our listeners are not lawyers. So let's say, so maybe on adjournments, what would be your take?
Oh, sure. I can go first, and then Surya can add add later.
Yes.
See, and this is where we have tried to do some work with the courts also. And one of my, actually, Amulya, who's written that piece, is one of our colleagues at Daksh, and she's tried to examine, what this does. So one of the things that we are focusing on, and what Amulya has also studied, is to examine. See, when you're giving an adjournment, okay. Now, there could be valid reasons and there could be invalid reasons. Absolutely. Now, why do people ask for adjournment? And what is an adjournment? Let us
start from that, sir. That's what I want to highlight. Yes, sir.
An adjournment is, a request. So I gave you earlier, I talked about listing a case being listed tomorrow. So suppose you have a case in court and that case is listed for tomorrow. Generally speaking, there are two parties to a case. The person who has filed the case and against, the other person against whom you have filed a case. They're in civil cases. If it's a criminal case, the police is prosecuting, there's an accused. Yes, now, adjournment means, so when the case is called out, one party or both parties can say, I'm not ready, or there is some problem in proceeding with this. Please give me some time. That is one thing. That's the first thing. That is where one of the parties is asking for more time.
Right.
Second reason, there could be too many cases before the court tomorrow. The judge may have 100 cases, and it is not possible. It is impossible to hear 100 cases within 5 hours. So the judge may say, I don't have time today, I will post it on another day.
Right.
That's another example. Or a witness may have had to come. Let's say it's a criminal case. The police inspector who investigated had to come. He could not come because he is investigating some other case today. So if the witness is not there, how will you proceed? So there's an adjournment. So there are various reasons why adjournments are given. As I said, some valid and some not valid.
Not valid.
Now, what has happened in our process is this culture of seeking adjournments is become a matter of routine. Now, that should not happen, and this is linked to the certainty point that I made earlier. As all the actors in the system need to take a date seriously. And if a matter is listed, everybody should make all efforts to actually make that happen. And because that is not there, and because people are able to give adjournments, people are able to take and obtain adjournments easily, it's become a self-replicating mechanism. So there is no certainty, there is no sort of seriousness about a date that is given, unless it's a critical hearing. Now, who do we blame? I mean, there are all of the people we talk about are to blame. But at the end of the day, it's the system. It's the person who is in control of the system who needs to take charge, right? And needs to firmly say, we won't give adjournments. And the law is clear. The law says that you can't give adjournment just like that. You have to record reasons, all of it.
Absolutely.
And it comes down to lack of scheduling properly, not knowing what the capacity of the judge that day is, not knowing the capacity of the lawyer. Because we are dealing with all these uncertainties, a culture of adjournments has developed. So my colleague in this paper analyzes some of these details and comes up with some suggestions.
Oh, wonderful. Mr. Surya, your take, sir, now on this, because I've been having Harish sir on and on. I would like now you to maybe introspect and give us a gist.
So I think I will while the problem statement has been made, and the only thing I would add here is the what we have been following so far is a litigant-led litigation. You let the parties and the lawyers, most probably the lawyers, say, I'm ready, I'm not ready, I'm 2 weeks from now, 1 week from now. There is a need. Everybody globally is recognizing the need for court-led litigation to happen, which is to say, if you approach a body for a decision, then that body takes over the schedule of the case, which is what case flow management is all about, which is where, the documents are made ready before they all agree on a schedule and say, okay, these are the dates, these are the times, everybody will have so many minutes, and we get over it and move on. so which is really the principle of court-led litigation, which is the change that the UK system made in the late 90s, and India needs to follow. The solutions for that on the adjournment culture the adjournment culture is leading to a lot of delay. We have seen that there are a lot of solutions being suggested for that particular cause. One of them is increasing the number of judges. Everybody, wherever you go to judicial delay, they say shortfall of judges, which is what Siddharth and I have taken up in our chapter and said, we're going to see, okay, in one particular district, there has been an increase in the number of judges, but what did it really mean? And we're not talking about 1 year or 6 months. We looked at 18 years of data, and we looked at 5 years of data after there was an increase in the judicial strength in one district of Karnataka. And we found that there was no significant increase in the time taken for disposal of cases, or decrease in the time taken for disposal, or in any other metrics. So really, that means to say that there are other factors in play. It is not just a supply constraint. There are other players and other rules of the game. Everybody is playing. It's important to understand that there are no bad actors. Everybody is trying to maximize their benefit as per the rules that are already in play. And the rules here would mean both formal rules and behavioral norms that are in play. So we really have to tweak those to make any significant change in the system.
I agree with you to a larger extent, sir. And as far as increasing, I think, judicial members and having a judiciary, that's, I think, one part of the ball game. But what really is to be needed and checked here, at least, is that the coherence between different systems that are working, especially at least on the criminal side of things. Maybe I can say that, between police and judiciary, and the lag that we get because of the autonomous, of course, each being autonomous in a way. But those lags are something which I would say are the chinks in the armor. And they need to be sealed in terms of increasing the accountability to maybe speed up process. I have spoken about only one field, maybe in all the other fields. I'd also like to put in a point, sir, where we can maybe I can have your views. I think transcription is one of the things in our courts that can make, at least from a lawyer's perspective, lawyers more accountable to the whole process, and maybe also bring some semblance to the proceedings, because that's one of the things that we are lacking, and we had it in pre-independence era when we had judicial courts under the British, which we now don't have. Would you agree? Would you agree to an extent, sir, Harish sir and Surya sir? Both question to both of you. Wouldn't you agree that if we had transcription, it would really help, because then we would have at least, the reason for adjournment that I've seen some of the times is that one of the lawyers says that I don't even remember what happened the last time when you appeared and made your statements, and what we recorded in the court are some of the important facts of the case. And apart from that, nothing is accountable. And that can be one of the things that I feel maybe it can help, sir. What would be your take, sir?
I will let Surya take the lead on this, because he's done some work on transcription and all that.
So it's a yes and no, Amber, because this is just one aspect. Just because you record it does not mean there are no silver bullets. In this, we have to understand that the judiciary is a large, complex, adaptive system. So if you try to squeeze it and poke it at one point, it will bulge out at some other point. So we have to have a multi-pronged approach, but transcription is a very important tool that needs to be employed to hold players responsible for their actions, accountable for their actions. I was very surprised when I read that transcription was a part of our court proceedings in the British days, and the famous Bal Gangadhar Tilak sedition case, which was argued by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. This very famous transcripts fully are available even today for us to enjoy the court craft. A lot of the court craft that many people enjoy watching and learning from are lost because transcription practice was stopped. There are supply side constraints to this. There are, of course, other factors not ensuring transparency, all of those things. But with technology really being available to us literally at a click of a button. The whole podcast that we are now recording, it can be converted into a transcript with an 80 to 90% accuracy in 2 to 5 minutes maximum.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? Just imagine the technology. And I'm talking also of Indian languages, which is also important.
Right.
So with such technology available to us at scale, really, we should not be shying away from deploying it for the larger social purpose.
Absolutely, sir. Harish, sir, your take on it, then I'll move to the next segment maybe, because I'm sure you would be experiencing this on a daily basis, and you're more experienced on the same. So,
yeah, no, as Surya said, there is no silver bullet to this. So transcription would certainly help. It will throw more light on what happens. And, as many people say in many contexts, sunlight is one of the best disinfectants. So having a record of everything certainly helps. And technically speaking, even now there is record, but the records, because the pressure on courts are so much, they're not able to record every small detail that goes in. Right? So certainly having a full record of what happens in court in each hearing will certainly help. There's no doubt about it.
Absolutely, sir. Now, sir, as per the book and going through the content, we were talking about the economic effects and other effects of this. And one of the major is maybe a case study which I see on under trials. And and that's something that I'm seeing and I'm very happy about, because a couple of years back I was doing a study, maybe let's say, which was Nadan-centric with a colleague of mine as to the plight of under trials in the whole system and their families, and let's say the children of such under trials who sometimes do not have enough parents or family, etc., extended family to take care of them, and then comes the under trial and the mental and the other effect on it as far as our fundamental rights are concerned. I think that's a whole gambit, which is another game which most of the Indians are not aware of. Sir. Let's highlight that in the book that you mentioned, sir.
Yes, Amber, and this is one of the tragedies of India. Right? About, and this percentage varies, but the estimate is that between 60 to 70% of prisoners in our prisons today are under trials. Meaning, and for the listeners, they have not been convicted.
Right, sir.
So trial is going on. They have been arrested. No bail is given, and they are in prison. Right? So even before you are convicted, you're spending a lot of time in prison. Now, one of the fundamental tenets of any justice system is you should assume that a person is not guilty unless you are able to prove that he is guilty. Right?
Right, sir.
Now, the fact that so many of our prisons contain people who are not convicted. And it's two things, right? It's an outcome, or rather a consequence of our judicial delay. That's one thing. The second is the complete ignorance of their rights, despite repeated rulings by the Supreme Court, time and again, right? So it's one of the tragedies of our justice system that we have been holding up people in prisons and without them being convicted. And it goes back. See, and I think we sometimes, as lawyers and law scholars, we forget what is at stake. See, locking up a person is the biggest punishment that society can impose on a person, because what you're doing when you're locking up somebody, you are depriving the liberty of that person.
Right, sir.
Right, and doing this in such a light manner that I will hear your case sometime. You stay in prison until that time.
Right, sir. Absolutely.
It's very, is a tragedy beyond comparison. And Professor Vijay Raghavan, who's written this report, has done yeoman service in this. He's a professor at Tata Institute of Social Sciences.
Right.
He's done tremendous work. He and his team have done a lot of work in Maharashtra, particularly in prisons, trying to help under trials, trying to get them their rights and all of that. So this is a chapter I would encourage everyone to read.
Absolutely, sir. And just to put it out to the listeners, I've had a very recent HNI client who's also under trial. even though he's not been convicted, but bringing out the cat out of the box. So it still exists, and so rightly, it is a problem with majority of our courts that that this does not is not taken up by courts. But so don't you feel it's a constitutional violation? Let alone, I would say, in the sense that whatever is enshrined in the Constitution, where I say that every convict also has rights, or let's say an accused has a right to a speedy trial before a unilateral and non-biased judicial bench. But reaching there has become an issue for our country because you don't even get there.
No, and it is a constitutional right, Amber, and you're absolutely right. And the Supreme Court has declared it many times.
So many cases, sir. We've seen so many
trial
cases.
Is part of Article 21.
Article 21.
Many times. So
absolutely,
there is no two words about it. It is a blot on our system. It needs to be resolved. And some of the stories are tragedy. At least you talked about you talked about your client and a HNI person. And while we shouldn't compare.
Absolutely,
anyone who is deprived of his liberty is a prisoner. But there are real tragic cases. People who have been caught for stealing a biscuit packet, for example.
Yes.
And not being able to give bail and are in prison, and the trial has not happened. Now this is it is comic, right? It is almost comic. It is unreal situation. So we need to we have to find some solutions to this.
You said, sir, do some work on the LGBT activism. And there have been cases in Delhi where we've seen that people from the community have been picked up by police. And there are matters where they have not been represented for a small act of maybe hanging out together as well. They've been imprisoned or maybe convicted under one of the sections. And they don't have access to justice. And nobody stands up and actually goes there. So, so many sections in India, so many diverse, communities, and this is what one of the spilling effects, as we discussed. Sir. Now, coming to the next part of the book, sir, there's also another interesting para I'd seen, sir. This was about victims of human trafficking and their struggle for justice. Sir. Maybe if you guys can throw some light, because this is a real hard-hitting fact, which most of us will agree to, because human trafficking in India and the surrounding laws and encompassing the impact on society, that would be really insightful. Maybe if you can talk about how this is interpreted in the light of judicial activism.
So if I can take that, Amber, it is just shocking that even in the 21st century, there is something such as forced labor, bonded labor in our country. And clearly, there are some pockets of our country and some populations which are more prone to it because of their socio-economic conditions.
Right.
But what this chapter by the team at ICJ and IJM, the Indian International Justice Mission, which has done a lot of work in this area internationally too, and in India, a fantastic data-driven article that they have contributed to this book. They want to highlight how a justice system operates for these kind of people. Just imagine you are forced to go somewhere else. Somebody just picks you up and makes you go, say, from Orissa to Karnataka, and you are working in some brick or kiln factory. And fortunately, there is somebody who releases you, who arrives, saves you, and there is a case filed against this person who was making you toil day and night. And you are sent back home with facilities and a job. But this case here, for the person who has been accused of this crime and for him to be punished, there is this constant need for these people to come and appear at the court.
Right.
And for them to spend so much time and money is a complete non-starter. So what it means to these kind of people is just very painful to watch, actually, really speaking. And they have brought this out. The human story of it with the use of data has been brought out very nicely in this chapter, and another must read in this collection.
Absolutely, sir. And I see that, in addition to this, you've also covered the LGBT aspect, which I was talking about, the adverse effect on them as well. Because that is one part of the community where people would be amazed to know that they earn so less, which is roughly, let's say, less than $200, even maybe for a whole month for some of them. And then they are also subjugated to such a situation. So I think I would request all listeners to actually go through this, because this is very interesting and it forms a major part of how the system operates. So now the next head that I would like to take up with you, which I think all our listeners would be amazed to go through, is the corporate strategy for litigation management, sir. And this talks about the perspectives of the in-house counsel. And most of Indian young lawyers, it is a must that they go through this, sir. Harish sir and Suri sir, please highlight on this, because I think this would be very, very interesting for non-practicing and maybe in-house lawyers as well.
Yeah, so this is actually written by two lawyers who are working in-house in one of the GE Group companies. Although this is their personal view.
Right.
See, it was one of the things that we were trying to do, Amber, when we put together this book, is to get people to look at the same issue but from a different perspective.
Right.
So while we have discussed about lawyers and address, but we also wanted to see what is the what is happening within a company which has to deal with a lot of litigation.
Right.
One of the things that in India, a buzzword that has appeared is ease of doing business. Somehow courts are not enforcing contracts, so there's an impact on ease of doing business. So we thought, okay, let's try and understand what happens within a company. I mean, when do they decide to file a case? When they know that it's going to take a long time for that case to be decided. And one of the difficulties has been, like, are they willing to put good money after bad money? Because litigation is expensive in India. If you have to recover money from somebody else in India, it's very difficult because, there is no guarantee that the money will come back, and you have to spend a lot of time and energy on it. So what are the strategies that, people follow in this country? And while this is the downside of being in India, what has also happened is people have come up with their own ways of managing it, right? Sure. So you have a lot of reliance on management properly, some sort of mediation, corporate mediation.
Absolutely.
Trying to use arbitration, but then that's another problem.
Right.
But then one of the biggest impacts that we have noticed is the how clients or corporates view risk, right? In terms of litigation risk, how is it? How do they look at it, and whether they are willing to enter into contracts with other parties whom they do not trust very much.
Right.
So these are all factors that have been addressed, and what is the strategy that people follow in corporate litigation. So it seems that the motto is, and this is not just from the article, but from generally dealing with other clients, don't go to court unless you're forced to.
Absolutely, sir. And no matter what MNC and what corporate client you're dealing with from the IT sector, sir, I think that's the trend, which is there, sir.
And unfortunately, what we don't realize is, because people take this approach, there's a big impact on the development of the law itself. Right, in this country, for example, since your podcast focuses on the law, there's not been much development in contract law, because people their rights are not agitated and decided on a regular basis.
No,
so that's a challenge for this country.
And rightly said, sir, if you look at even the employment and termination of employment contracts, the widest judicial interpretation that we have does not actually cover majority of the population and the cases that we get. So one aspect of it, yes, and commercially also, sir, your point on that is absolutely there. Now, I'll also like to bring in another interesting part that I saw, sir, which was about labor courts. And in the wake of recent, changes during COVID-19, which we saw in the labor side of things for certain states in India who waived off majority of the provisions to ensure they get efficacy and efficiency in attaining the maximum output. I see in the book, sir, there's a wonderful section which says labor cost, and it says, does nature of dispute affect the extent of delay? So, sir, maybe for all labor enthusiasts there, because we do get a lot of listeners and people from the labor law perspective, what insight would you have, sir, so that maybe they can gain from, because this is pretty interesting what you've covered there, sir.
So Amber, so the person who's written this piece is actually, again, somebody who works at Daksh. It is Shruti Nayak.
Sure.
So see, what we wanted to do is, labor anyway is it suggests a balance of power, right, between somebody
Right, sir. Right, sir.
who is employed by an employer, and then if he's fighting in his employer in a court, then you're starting anyway in an unequal power equation, and then you're also in court. And what happens when it gets delayed? See, one of the things we don't realize is that if you're an employee who has been suspended, for example, and therefore not getting your salary,
sir,
and you're fighting in court,
right, sir,
and the case takes a long time. Now, it's not as if your life stops. You still have if you have kids, you have to pay for their schools. If
right,
you
sir,
have aged parents, you have to, take care of their medical expenses.
Absolutely, sir.
So what we wanted to see is, what does this do to, to the power equation anyway, right?
Sure.
So
Sure.
because courts are unable to decide quickly on issues of labor, does it mean cases don't go to court? Is exploitation increasing? Or is it the other way around? Do people use this as, leverage against the employer? Some of these questions are examined, and it's an interesting analysis. So, I would encourage all of your listeners to look at this chapter.
Absolutely, sir. And coming to the end of this, two interesting another paras that I went through, and maybe now you can also elucidate on the same, is regarding the government litigation. What I read said that how can technology help legal information management? And regarding education departments, which is interesting, sir, is excessive litigation detracting from their primary focus? Now, you've hit the nail there, sir, I would rather say. And if all those enthusiasts who want to go through the book, I think this is where you hit the nail. Surya, sir, now your turn to maybe again elucidate on these topics, sir.
Right now, these are really two wonderful chapters, and we are so lucky to have them in our collection. The education department first, and Malini Mallikarjun, who's written this chapter, has worked closely on this topic at the Piramal Foundation for some time now. She's told us in this chapter that how the senior officials in the education department, why do you have an education department? To improve educational outcomes, to improve social impact of good education, to design programs which are more effective. But she has pointed out and told that how 60% to 70% of the senior officials' time in education department is going in managing litigation. We were just shocked when we first heard this, because of the way they are managing the litigation. There is no information flow between the courts and the education department. And there are a lot of cases because of the political economy in how schools and colleges are granted approvals, and their grants in aid that are continuously given every year. There is this complete cycle that is going on, and the effect on that is the productivity of the education department. Such a tragedy for the society as a whole.
Absolutely.
And Mr. Ajay Gupta, who was an OSD at the Ministry of Legal Affairs to build their litigation management system, again trying to solve the same problem but at a different scale. He is trying to solve cross government departments at the union government level, how there can be seamless flow of information. Just that, is a notice received, are summons issued, very basic. Is a paper book filed? When is the counter due? Right? When is my rejoinder due? Very basic information. There is asymmetry.
Absolutely, sir. And on these, no, sir, rightly said by you. In fact, one of the major problems is, again, as you said, disconnection, and that needs to be addressed definitely on the issue. Also, I was reading about a section, sir, which was about the transaction cost things in PILs. I'd like now Harish says, sir, on the PILs issue. We see the courts filled with PILs, and how we are dealing with them. So most of them, even being frivolous, are being disposed of. But there are so many that are stacked up. It's very difficult to classify. At whatever level it is. So maybe, sir, you can highlight on this point. Surya sir, let's start with you, and then I'll come to Harish sir on this.
So this concept of transaction cost is very closely linked to the concept of case law management and court-led litigation, which
Right,
is
sir.
to say, if you are if it is applying that concept to the PIL category of cases, and very nicely done in this chapter. Sridhar is a if I may use the word, the veteran in managing PILs, filed many cases, and he was assisted by Ritvika Sharma, who was earlier with Daksh as the research associate. So they actually apply some quantitative methods to attribute costs to the transactions and clearly bring out that if the PILs, if people were aware, if the judges were aware of what these PILs actually mean, here costs would mean both direct costs and indirect costs to the society as a whole.
Right.
Because PILs by their nature apply to a large section of people. If one were aware of the cost, people would be more serious. The courts would be more serious in handling PILs.
Sir, in this part, I'll also want to take Harish sir's view, sir. I mean, but as lawyers and maybe as senior lawyers, you generally see people come up to you for all the while reasons for let's say, for PILs, and we have so many frivolous PILs. So, would you say, in terms of PILs, that it is also the public exercising their right vis-a-vis, the judges or maybe the judicial system being overburdened because there is such a flagrant violation in the country? Is that right term to use, sir, to justify such a delay in PILs?
Yeah, so PILs, is what should I say? It's one of those tools that the Indian judiciary has developed about which all of us now have mixed feelings, right?
Right, sir.
Now, I'll say why. PIL, first, the positive. PILs are great in the sense that it brings the attention of the judiciary to certain issues which have been ignored and where there have been blatant violations. And the people who are directly affected by these violations are not able to come to court themselves, right? And that's the spirit in which it was developed also originally. And Justice Leela Seth actually, coins a word for this. She calls PILs initiatory democracy. She says because people, the enlightened citizens take up these issues and bring them to court, it actually has caused a lot of result in a number of things. So just to take, for example, Vishaka, which is a classic example, which resulted in a new law. So these are all important things. But you are also right. PILs hide in it. The success of PILs also hides a lot of problems, right? Now, PILs would not be necessary if everything was functioning properly, right?
Absolutely.
So the more number of PILs means there are more problems, right? So that's the first thing. Second thing, I think lawyers need to be more judicious in terms of bringing everything to court.
Yes, sir. Yes.
So lawyers I believe that lawyers have a professional responsibility to examine every cause that comes to them and see whether it is really worth filing a PIL, right? Whether there are other avenues. Now, I don't think lawyers do that. PILs have also become, unfortunately, to some extent, a little bit of publicity hogging mechanism.
Absolutely.
Which needs to be discouraged. But PILs are generally a useful tool. What courts have done with PILs is a separate, analysis. Whether they have gone too far in certain cases or not, that's a issue that is still open and being discussed. But by and large, it's a useful tool to have in this system when access to justice is a problem. So I think it's something we need to debate more often and debate in more detail.
Right, sir.
With data. We have not been debating with data.
I think, and on that note, since we are closing on the time, I would like to say that, the book is very well researched. As far as the heads we've discussed has just been snippets of what these two exemplary gentlemen have put together and maybe all the others who are named in the book. So I would like all of you individuals out there, all listeners out there, to definitely get a copy and have a look at it because it seems pretty insightful. And for all those people who are trying to pursue law and want to get into the game of law, be professional by going through the book because it quantifies the data that you need to see before you assume the responsibility of a lawyer. Sir, any last words from you guys before we close the edition? It was pretty insightful to have a chat with you, gentlemen. So, last words from you, sir.
Yeah, so I think justice is something that concerns all of us. It's one of the, one of the 4 things that we have promised ourselves in our preamble.
Right,
justice is something we have assured all our citizens.
Right,
and we need to be we need to all pay attention to what is happening to the justice system.
Right.
So read the book as a start, but beyond that, please start paying attention and asking the right questions to people who are in a position to make change.
Absolutely, sir. So, sir, any last take from you, sir?
Just to reiterate, I think justice sector, justice system has implications for all of us, whether we realize it or not. So it is has an outsized impact on the rest of the society.
Absolutely.
So we should really be worried and concerned and work towards making it as well-meaning or as imagined in the Constitution for everybody's benefit.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Harish, sir. Thank you, Surya, sir, for being on the show. And thanks for your valuable time. It was a value addition. So, guys, do catch out the book. I'm going to release the details of the book on my link on the podcast. And you can reach out to me on contact@amranaventures.com. Just in case you want to get in touch with the gentleman, I'll be definitely sharing the information with their permission, of course. But thank you, sirs. Thank you so much for being there. And it was a pleasure indeed to have you guys here, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amber.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for listening to Know Your Kanun. Catch Know Your Kanun on the IVM website or the app or anywhere you get your podcast from.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money. So, a great week of shows behind us, and hope that you've been catching up on as much of it as you can. We had Abhishek Bachchan on Football Shitball. Yeah, let me say that again. Abhishek Bachchan was on Football Shitball. Did I mention Abhishek Bachchan was on Football Shitball? That was a fun episode. You should definitely check that out. Really, really deep conversation about cricket and things like that. We had Vikram Kochar on Cyrus Says, talking about the platforms and stuff like what's going on over there. On the note, Maruk had spoken to Sanjay Jha, which was again a really, really interesting conversation. On Edges and Sledges, the guys are having an interesting conversation about, well, what are favorite formats of cricket and things like that. So it's just really been a really, really awesome week on the network, and please do check things out. And with that, hope to see you next week.
Namaskar, this is Ashish Vidyarthi. Yes, my friend, these are challenging times, but in these challenging times, we can create something extraordinary. Do take time to listen to my podcast, Begin the Journey, available on the IVM Podcast, website, app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Remember, we have a great opportunity called life. Cheers.